Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, welcome back everyone. It's our custom to go around the room and introduce ourselves, and then I'll introduce the group. My name is Grisha.
Hi, Alma.
Laura.
Bill.
Matthew.
Steve.
My name's Ray.
Michael. Bob.
My name's Jeff.
Jenna.
I'm David.
Heather. Bob. Tom.
Guys, and online we have Noel, Michael, Richard, Kai, John, Christian, Frisco, Joe, Jeffrey, Ron, and Jidus. Welcome online and in person. David Lewis is our speaker today, and David has been following the Dharma path for 50 years and has a degree in comparative religious studies. He teaches at several Buddhist sanghas around the Bay Area and offers a weekly meditation group for seniors, currently on Zoom. It's through Open House, a nonprofit serving the LGBTQ plus seniors. He's always happy to return to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship, where he gave his first Dharma talk in 2008. All right, thank you, David.
Good. Thank you, Grisha. Welcome, everyone. I sometimes feel a little guilty starting a Dharma talk after a nice sit like that. Because hopefully in the sit you were fully involved in the present moment, no matter what was going on with you. You might have had a busy mind or not, but you were present and hopefully mindful. And now I'm going to tempt you to drift away from that and get caught up in your cognitive mind. So don't. Or at the very least, I invite you to try to keep like 25% of your awareness on your body. Maybe just felt sense of sitting in a seat, or any aches or pains to keep you in the present moment. Very useful meditation objects. And if you get lost in trying to figure out what I'm talking about, because some of what I'm addressing today is a little bit heady, just let go of it. Because explaining things like the Dharma can take us away from direct experience, which is exactly what the Buddha tried not to do, and into metaphysics, or into beliefs, or into ideas about things. And the Buddha avoided metaphysics. It's something that surprises a lot of Westerners. The Buddha didn't talk about the meaning of things. The Buddha was much more interested about how things work. He was more more interested in direct experience than in ideas. So this is one of the fairly unique things about Buddhism. And hence the emphasis on meditation rather than belief or ideas in Buddhism. In fact, I think most of the Buddha's talks, which they're just, books and books of suttas that have been recorded, most of them are, if you really pay attention, are instructions on how to be present or how to be in the world. So this is a pretty foreign approach, this idea of gaining wisdom through meditation, through silence. A foreign approach to most of us Westerners who grew up in an educational system that taught us that if you want to learn something, you think about it, or read, or listen to a talk. Thich Nhat Hanh said that understanding does not arise as a result of thinking. It is the result of a long process of conscious awareness. Sometimes, he said, understanding can be translated into thoughts, but thoughts are too limited to carry too much understanding. That's the end of that quote. So, ignorance, the word ignorance, the idea of ignorance, in Buddhism is not the same thing as it is in the West or in English. Ignorance in Buddhism is not stupidity or lack of information. It's our failure to see things clearly in the present moment. Ignorance is ignoring what's happening in the present. Often because we're so caught up in our heads. We ignore what's happening in the present moment. And that's why ignorance is the beginning of the chain of dependent origination that leads to suffering in Buddhism. So clearly seeing is not about belief in Buddhism. It's about perception or insight. You can be incredibly learned, but ignorant if you are lost in thought and not aware of the present moment. Ignorance is often rooted in misperception. Perception is one of the 5 aggregates or phenomena that constitute our idea of ourselves. The body, our feelings or reactions to things, perception, the mind, and consciousness are the 5, what the Buddha called aggregates, that make up our idea of ourselves. And I'll get to that later. So our perception of ourselves and the world in general is deeply conditioned by our life experience, by our education, by our parents, our families. But our perception is often erroneous. What we think is real and true often is not. And one of the ways that the Buddha talked about this is he used the metaphor of I believe it was 4 blind men being introduced to an elephant. And so 4 blind men were brought to an elephant and asked what it was. And the first one grabbed the trunk and said, "Oh, this is a great snake." And the second one got a leg and said, "It's a tree." And the third one grabbed an ear and said, "Oh, it's a palm leaf, clearly." And the fourth one grabbed the tail and said, "Oh, it's rope." So who was correct? Which one had it right? They each had a perception that was real for them in the moment and were probably quite sure of their assumption. But of course, none of them were right. And this is a great metaphor for how we perceive life and the differences that we have, how you and I can experience the same phenomena and have 2 different, completely different understandings of it. So as I said, ignorance, in this sense, is the beginning of dependent origination, which is kind of the flowchart of how suffering unfolds. Dependent origination is often defined as not understanding the Four Noble Truths, which is not a bad definition. But it's really more about, I think, the failure to grok the nature of reality, not being able to see the elephant. The Burmese teacher U Tejaniya said, "We get lost in concepts. We need to see the difference between the concepts we use to create a convincing mental picture of reality and reality itself. We need to see the difference between the concepts we use to create a convincing mental picture of reality and reality itself." So that's kind of a powerful thing to practice with, is the idea that the way I'm seeing the world right now, the way I'm seeing all of you in this room and on the screen, is just a rather convincing mental picture of reality. In Buddhism, the remedy for ignorance is insight. This particular practice that we do is sometimes called insight meditation. Insight is not about intellectual understanding, but rather a deeper intuitive seeing that is often the side effect of silence, reflection, and simply noticing what's going on at the present moment. I'm reading a book at home right now by Robert Bea called The Seeing That Frees, a Buddhist book. He says, Robert Bea defines insight as any realization, understanding, or way of seeing things that brings a dissolution of or a decrease in dukkha. So it's not intellectual, it's about dissolving dukkha. The best synonym for insight that I've come up with in English is a word I already used, grokking. And some of you may know that grok is a word that was invented by Robert Heinlein in his 1961 science fiction novel, Stranger in a Strange Land. And in this novel, the science fiction novel, which I read when I was probably, 18 years old, an alien comes to Earth and kind of like being like an anthropologist from outer space, this alien tries to figure out what we're all about. And we're a pretty complicated problem. But he did this through grokking. And it was something that the alien mind, because I remember the alien was neither male nor female or both. I can't remember if anybody knows, correct me. Do you?
I remember him being male.
Being male? Okay, well, I'll say he then. So the alien was able to intuitively understand situations and people and ideas and cultures. And he called it grokking, and it was more about, it was not just about understanding, it was more about becoming one with. He actually became one with whatever he was trying to absorb. So to grok something is to internalize it, to understand it on a deeper level. So we can't grok a math problem, but we can grok or have insight into, say, vulnerability or impermanence, or the Four Noble Truths, for that matter. Because usually insight is something that we already understand on an intellectual level. With insight, we gain a deeper understanding. Barry Gillespie highlights this when he says that the path isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. You continually come back to things you thought you understood and see a deeper truth. If any of you had that experience, you thought you knew something, but then either through practice or through learning or through experience, you get, oh, I thought I knew what that was about, but now I do. And when I first started having those kinds of insights, it made me very humble about anything that I thought I knew at all. Well, I thought I knew, but now I do, but maybe I don't. So this kind of deeper insight, which often arrives uninvited, it just comes up in practice or in daily life, is one of the great joys of meditation practice. At least that's my experience. Insight is a gift. It's one of the wonderful things about meditation practice. We can intellectually understand the universality of impermanence. But if you really grok impermanence, you'll have no fear of death or loss or change. Old age, illness, and death are what are supposed to happen. They're nature. So insight often leads to letting go of our reactivity to nature. Our reactivity to the nature of things. This is the seeing that frees. I love that title, the title of that book, because insight, or seeing clearly, is indeed liberating. As I said, it's not an intellectual understanding, it's seeing the nature of things and accepting that life is unreliable, that we make things more difficult for ourselves than we need to by imagining that what is impermanent is permanent. And we can free ourselves from suffering by letting go and accepting that things are just the way they are. So if you haven't noticed yet, I'm talking about the Noble Truths now, or at least the first three of them. Recognizing that life is unreliable, dukkha. Understanding that we get attached to wanting things to be reliable, which is craving, and that causes suffering. Unless we let go. And if we let go, we're liberated. And that's the third noble truth. Freedom from suffering. And we can clearly see this. The Buddha said, I teach only suffering and freedom from suffering. So this, I believe, is a joyful declaration. The Four Noble Truths are a practice, not a belief. This is what we do in meditation every time we sit, whether you know it or not. If we don't just sit and ruminate, which is fabricating mental picture of reality, then we will notice that thoughts rise and pass just as quickly as sounds come and go. Thoughts are not the problem. It's getting attached that causes suffering. But if we were mindful, and if we notice that this is happening, we have the opportunity to let go and experience the gift of peace. Ajahn Chah reminds us that if you let go a little, you'll have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you'll have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. And your struggles with the world will have come to an end. So it doesn't matter what your thoughts are about. In practice, we simply notice that thoughts are happening in the same way that we notice that sounds are happening or bodily sensations are happening. That discomfort or sadness or tranquility or joy are just happening, rising and passing away until they become something else. Everything changes, and that's the nature of things. When Indraji says, sit and know that you're sitting and the whole of the Dhamma will be revealed. So you don't need to be a great academic scholar. You don't need to read books or even listen to talks like this. You have everything you need to wake up. Sit and know you're sitting and the whole of the Dhamma will be revealed. It's knowing the nature of phenomena, of change which is revealed by insight, that matters, not the content of your thoughts. So if your meditation this morning consisted of monkey mind, or sleepiness, or distraction, or just getting lost in a story, that wasn't a failure of meditation. It was just what was happening for you in the moment. And if you suffered, if you were uncomfortable with whatever was happening in the moment in your meditation, it was probably because you thought something else ought to be happening, something else other than what was actually happening. That's what causes us suffering. Not squeaky chairs. Or aversion to squeaky chairs. Oh, if you suffered in your meditation this morning, it's because you thought something else ought to be happening. If you can let go of that resistance, you'll experience some freedom. So if you had some discomfort, If you noticed it, if you let go of it, you just experienced pretty much the whole of the Four Noble Truths in your meditation this morning. Freedom is accepting the nature of things rather than wishing they were different. So the Buddha suggested that the most profound and life-changing insights, the most important ones from his perspective, were the insights into the three characteristics of existence: dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Unreliability, impermanence, and not self. I want to talk a little bit about these three characteristics. Sometimes they're referred to as the three universal truths. And you can check this out in your own experience. If my description of it doesn't make sense, check it out for yourself. Now, the first one I'll talk about is anicca in the Pali language, which is impermanence. I've already mentioned it. The Buddha said, everything changes, continually becoming otherwise. That's a great line to remember for practice. Everything changes, continually becoming otherwise, including you. So did you notice that maybe in your meditation this morning? If you weren't caught up in your thoughts, if you weren't lost in your thoughts, what you would have noticed is that it's just one after another. It's just change in the breath, and then another breath, and then it's bodily sensation, and then another bodily sensation. It's a deep bath and change sitting in meditation. Bhante Gunaratana says that watching impartially opens the mind to realize that there is no way that we can stop this flux, even for a fraction of a second. We experience the freshness of life. Every moment is a new moment. Every breath, a fresh breath. So the breath is a great metaphor and a great meditation object. That's why so many of us use it as our anchor, anchoring us in the present moment, because the breath only happens in the present moment. Anything in your body only happens in the present moment. And yet, it's always subtly changing. The breath is always changing. So you can go a long way just following the breath, just paying attention to your breath. Ajahn Chah again says, our lives are like the breath, like growing and falling leaves. When we can really understand about falling leaves, we can sweep the paths every day and have great happiness in our lives on this changing earth. There's an anicca chant, an impermanent chant, that is practiced in many traditions in many monasteries around the world. And it's also used quite often at funerals. Buddhist funerals, and the chant begins. I'm just going to give you the first four lines in English. The chant begins with, all conditioned things are impermanent. Their nature is to arise and pass away. To live in harmony with this truth brings the greatest happiness. So a lot of monastics, monks and nuns in Buddhism, start their day with this chant, and sometimes start with every set with chant. All conditioned things are impermanent. Their nature is to arise and pass away. To live in harmony with this truth brings the greatest happiness. When we truly absorb the universal truth of impermanence, as I said earlier, we'll lose our fear of death, of change, of illness. It's just nature. It's what's supposed to happen. Or, as Sally Tisdale says, know that your precious, infinitely beloved, and irreplaceable self will dissolve like a sandcastle, grain by grain. And what a relief it is to know. You exist in a great space of knowing, filled with shared ephemerability of all things. So the second characteristic of existence that I'll talk about is dukkha, which is as you know, also the first noble truth. Dukkha is much misunderstood by the West, partly because for so many years it's been defined as suffering, which is not entirely wrong, but it's just not the best definition. I think it's somewhat more accurate to define dukkha as unsatisfactoriness. But even more, one of my preferred definitions of dukkha is unreliability. And especially from the perspective of it being a universal characteristic of existence, we can see that everything's unreliable. This body's unreliable. This building's unreliable. It would come down in an earthquake that's got brick walls. The environment's unreliable. Our political system is unreliable. Life is unreliable. It's like the metaphor I like to use for that is it's like standing on a sandy beach right at the edge of the water with your feet kind of in the water and the waves are washing over your feet, and you think you're solid, but if you just stand there, you start to become unstable. This sand starts disappearing underneath your feet. And I think that's my favorite metaphor for that's the way life is. We think we're stable, but we're not really. So the Buddha taught that dukkha is both a characteristic of existence as unreliability, but also something that can become overcome, that can be overcome. And I used to think that was a paradox, but it's not. What the Buddha promised can be overcome is not the inherent unreliability of life, but the suffering that results from our resistance to that uncertainty and vulnerability. Life is unreliable, but we're uncomfortable with that. So most of us develop a certain amount of denial. Ajahn Chah, again, says there are two kinds of suffering. There's the suffering you run away from, which follows you everywhere. And there's the suffering that you actually face directly. And in doing so, become free. When we see the dukkha that's inherent in our sense desires and our addictions, including thinking's an addiction for most of us, they lose their enchantment. And we become disenchanted, which in Buddhism is considered a good thing, becoming disenchanted with our own thoughts, our own ideas about things. Guy Armstrong, who's a spirit rock teacher in Marin, says that suffering is only the friction between what is and what is wanted. So most of you know about the metaphor of the two arrows. That everything in life that happens to us is like getting hit by two arrows. The first arrow is whatever happens to us, maybe a cancer diagnosis or a loss. And the second arrow is is how we react to the first arrow, how we react to that loss or that diagnosis. And the Buddha said many times that most of our suffering comes from the second arrow, not the first one. That's something that we can have an impact on. That's something we can change in our lives. It's the second arrow of reactivity. So the three characteristics, including dukkha, are not a problem. Impermanence is not a problem. It's our habitual response to them that gives us trouble in life. U Tejaniya says there aren't many problems per se. Problems arise with craving, aversion, or delusion are present. We don't accept things as they are, so we exhaust ourselves desiring things that aren't present or pushing away things that are. And it really struck me when I first read that statement. He says, there aren't many problems per se in life. I mean, just imagine, there aren't many problems. It's just our reactivity. So suffering and awakening are not at odds with each other. They're part of the same weather system. So the third and final of the three characteristics that I'll talk about is anatta in Pali, anatta, which is often translated as no self or not self. And of course, like the other two, this deserves a whole Dharma talk or a whole retreat all by itself. It often bewilders Westerners. But the Buddha never said that there is or that there is not a self or a soul. He invited us to see for ourselves. In Pali, the expression is ehipassiko. Ehipassiko in Pali means see for yourself. So when people ask the Buddha, he said, is there a self? We understand you're saying is there a self? And the Buddha said, ehipassiko, check it out in your own experience. Show me the self. He challenges us to identify what the self is, or where it is, or where it resides. Alan Watts, the American Buddhist of the 1950s and 60s, said, ego, the self which one has believed oneself to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. Ego is nothing but a pattern of habits. Conditioned habits. All habits are conditioned. The Buddha recognized that our idea of self is made up of the five aggregates, as I was talking about earlier on. Form, which is the body, feeling, perception, thinking, and consciousness. In his talk with his son Rahula, the Buddha's son's name was Rahula, and there's a famous sutta, Rahula Sutta. The Buddha said, nothing whatsoever should be clung to as I, me, or mine. Ajahn Chah said, when we see beyond self, we will no longer cling to happiness. And when we stop clinging, we can begin to be happy. And the great 20th century Dharma master, Albert Einstein, said that a human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for only the few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. That's Albert Einstein. Or as Robert Thurman put it, when you understand interconnectedness, it makes you more afraid of hating than of dying. So I recently heard a Dharma talk by a teacher. In fact, I think it was Robert Bea, who said that anicca, anatta, and dukkha, the three characteristics, were not actually calling them the three characteristics was not done in early Buddhism. That's something that kind of came later, and it's not erroneous to call them as three characteristics of existence, so we can see them this way. But he said the way the Buddha actually talked about it originally is more as three different ways of perceiving, nature of the world and existence. So in other words, they're not some metaphysical understanding of the nature of existence, but rather a way of seeing the nature of things. And that was an insight I got from a talk. It opened up a new way of understanding for me that has led to other insights. That's the way insights work. They kind of feed each other. So it's important to understand that understanding the three characteristics, or reflecting on them, or sitting with them, serves the interest of waking up. It's not just an idea. It's certainly not dogma. It should serve the interest of waking up, freeing us from suffering, seeing the nature of things, letting go of wanting to be different, and living in harmony with nature. I think the three characteristics are really a unity. I think they're one truth, but three different facets, like three different facets of the same crystal. Because if you think about it, life, which includes the mind, the body, relationships, all conditioned phenomena, mountains and trees, life is impermanent. It's the first characteristic. Seeing that impermanence of body and mind shows us that nothing can be held as me or mine. If everything's changing, how can it be a self? How can it be a solid thing? But this makes us a little bit uncomfortable. So resisting this fact of impermanence leads to dissatisfaction or suffering. And that's how the three characteristics are one thing. U Tejaniya said, if we practice correctly, life is always new and interesting because we're always seeing more. We are observing nature happening in the deepest possible way. So as I said earlier on, everything you already have, everything you need to wake up. You only just need to pay attention and to let go. Ahipasiko, the Buddha said. See for yourself. So that's what I have to share with you. I hope it didn't totally put you in your head. But if anything was confusing or unclear or wrong, now's your chance to please.
Thank you, David. That was very good. I really appreciate that talk experientially. And I wanted to ask you, as a recovering therapist, I think that, it's been said by Buddhist psychiatrists, we need to become somebody before we can become nobody. And you said that consciousness is one of the aggregates. Is that correct? Yeah. I mean, I know in Buddhism it's one of the sense doors, right?
No, the mind is a sense door.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
Yeah, but not consciousness. Yeah.
So, how would you? Could you say more about the consciousness as it's distinct from the mind?
Well, that's a really big question. And different people will answer it in different ways, because in different belief systems and different religions, and even within Buddhism, there's a belief that consciousness exists independently of us, or that there's universal consciousness. Whereas the mind is something that's deeply conditioned by our experience and by education and by what we've learned in the world. Consciousness is really one of the most fascinating topics in Buddhism, and also in science and neurology.
Yeah.
And who wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat? Oliver Sacks.
Yeah.
Oliver Sacks, who died a few years ago, was a neurologist that wrote a bunch of books and kind of popularized neurology. But he said he believed that consciousness was the last great unexplored territory of neurology. And it's kind of interesting, because what Buddha had to say about consciousness is increasingly being reinforced by what science is learning about consciousness. But we don't really know yet. So I actually trust the Buddha more than I trust the neurologists on that. I think they're going to end up coming around to this point of view. But because the other conclusion they're starting to come to is, and it's controversial, is that maybe there's no soul, maybe there's no self, which is really radical for Westerners. What the Buddha's been saying and said it 3,500 years ago.
Yeah, I find the same thing, and I venture to say that maybe there is a relative self. The self will, if you break your leg, you say, you don't say, take this body to the ER, me. And I think I'm glad to hear you talk about it, because it's not usually talked about in Buddhist circles, consciousness. I think that we're all have consciousness, awareness underneath all of our fetters and things, and there's only one of us.
Yeah, and it is important to have a sense of self and a sense of identity, but not to get attached to it.
Right.
For instance, we're here collectively with a sense of identity of being gay or queer, but does that separate us from other beings? Does that make us, is that a step away from interconnectedness? I'm just offering that as a reflection. Tom, please.
David, thank you so much. I like that I can always rely on you to put my head on tilt.
I'll quote you on that.
Yeah, I go back to how you started off talking about, the Buddha. There's a difference between the Western sense of ignorance and ignorance, ignoring things as they are. And, the Buddha encouraged us to rely on our own experience. But I see there's kind of a dilemma and a paradox and a trap in there, because there's so many people today who take that directive and they apply it, sort of whole cloth to everything. So, like, there's a recent presidential candidate from a famous family who dropped out recently, and he's well known for rejecting science unless it backs up his personal experience, and that's how he approaches the world. And there's so many people who it doesn't feel like the planet's getting warmer to me, so there's sort of this paradox. We should rely on our own experience. But, even the Dalai Lama, really looks into science. He relies on science. He incorporates that into his knowing and understanding. So, how do we use it in some places and go further afield and accept something other than our own experience to help us understand the world around us and not be influenced? Either Western or Eastern.
That's a great reflection. I don't think it's a paradox. I think when the Buddha said rely on your own experience, he didn't say get metaphysical and find meaning in ways that, in whatever you think is meaning. He says look at these three characteristics of your own experience. So when I rely on my own experience and I look deeply within, at how I think and approach the world, I realize that more often than not I'm wrong. And one of the things that impresses me when I'm talking to other Dharma practitioners is I'm really impressed by people who know what they don't know, rather than people think that they know what they know and that everybody ought to be agreeing with them. But one of the things I love about Buddhists is very often, because we sit with this, we realize that we're conditioned and we understand perception as being often erroneous, that we have a pretty good idea that we don't really know what we think we know. So that's not what you're hearing from people like the person you were talking about. They're not.
They're not. That's the answer. We humans desire certainty, And if we can get uncomfortable with uncertainty and not knowing and changing our minds and stuff, then maybe that's where...
We want to make real what isn't real. We want to make permanent what isn't permanent. We want to make me, mine, self, where there isn't a self.
Whether through science or our own thinking.
Either way.
Yeah, okay.
That's what humans do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great question.
Yeah.
Well, in that sense, then, that's where the sitting meditation helps, for lack of a better word, secure a point of view by accepting all things. So it's like being more, you are all content, and therefore whatever arises is just something that just is still part of you, and you can make a choice for the moment of how to respond if you're clear-sighted of the moment.
Yeah.
So the memories of that moment later on is just another photograph that you can look at and make reference, but not say, I did it before, I'll do it again. You know, so it's always being refreshed. We're always in a case of
It's that spiral I was talking about. Yeah. And U Tejaniya said something like, awareness is awareness of the present moment, but wisdom is knowing what's skillful and what's not skillful. So there's these two different things that are going on in our every moment experience as we're aware of what's going on. But if we have wisdom, we know what's skillful and what's not skillful.
And also that consciousness is just a characteristic of existence, and there's more to existence than just consciousness.
Or less. They're both true. They're both true. I don't know, this stuff is people outside of Buddhism think, well, that's mystical and deep. But it's not. It's just reality. It's just ordinary reality. It's just a different way of
But I
seeing.
would say that consciousness is not an object.
Right.
Yes. It's not a thing.
For the moment of talking, it's a conception.
Yes.
Our concept.
Yeah.
For me, thinking about science, not necessarily as a dogma, but earlier you mentioned that Buddha talked about just noticing how things are, and to me, in science, is when these conditions occur, this thing will often resolve, not always, and that is science, like the uncertainty principle. You can't know the exact position and velocity of something, so I mean, it's intrinsic in science that there is uncertainty, but often when these conditions occur, the following thing will result, which is just a noticing.
Exactly. Which is why the Dalai Lama likes science. They reinforce each other. There's just I see no conflict there.
Right.
It just excites me.
We should probably wrap up. If anybody online, just give a chance to speak up. Anyone online? No? All right. Well, thank you, David. And then we'll hear from our host. I'm going to put the mic over here. We had microphone troubles. So Tony, you want to speak up to this?
It's just if you want to stay, please stay and enjoy the company of the Sangha. There are some muffins and grapes out there. Well, will be soon. And there's hot water for tea, assuming. And we just leave the cups in the sink, and I'll clean them up. And I'm going to be standing there with a Don bowl asking for donations. We use those to do an honorarium for our speaker, to rent this beautiful place, and we put out a newsletter every quarter that mainly goes to prisoners, and we just did one recently. So we have a newcomer sign-up sheet on the credenza. And if you would like to get our newsletter with the roster of our participants, and some of the members get together and go out to eat for lunch they'll meet at the front door around 12:30. So.
Thank you. Any other announcements? Yes, please.
I would just want to add that one of the things that we do is we help people who can't afford retreats. We offer scholarships, and that's become a large part of what we do. And speaking of retreats, most of you know, a lot of you have signed up for the one on the weekend of the 20th of the land at the Medicine Buddha, but we still do have openings. So if you're interested, go to the retreats page.
Or if you have any questions, you can come to me today.
Yeah.
Because this is the last day of registration.
Yes, Tom?
Yeah, just those of you who don't know, reminder that another thing that we're doing, a new initiative, is we're putting all of our past and future videos of our Dharma talks onto YouTube and onto the website. So those are becoming available. And, in addition to our podcast, which is audio only. So if you haven't subscribed or you don't take advantage of that, it's a wonderful thing to be notified when each new talk goes up. So you can subscribe on YouTube, you can subscribe to the podcast, or you can just go to the website when you remember it. So it's all there.
Thank you. And thank you for your service to the side and getting that online. It's excellent. Any other announcements? I'll just say this is non-GBF sanctioned, but I have my building has a rooftop deck, and I try to very frequently have a full moon party. There's one coming up on September 17th. If you're interested, make sure I have your email, and I'll send you the invite. We just go up on the roof, and if there's no fog, we see the moon go up. If there's fog, we just look at each other. But,
It's still there.
It's a fun. It's still there. It's reliable, right?
And there's a nice fire just sitting there.
Fire pit here. So yeah, give me your email if you look up. And let's see. Oh, I didn't look up our next week's speaker. Let's see if I can grab it real quick. Unless someone knows, be good.
Okay, Dagon.
Okay, so next week our speaker is Dagon Gaither. And you can read his bio online. So, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. So sorry about the microphone problems, but folks online. I hope you didn't miss too much. And we gather for dedication of merit. Do you want to use ours, or do you have one that you'd like to offer?
Oh, wing it.
Okay. All right. Let's gather around the microphone.
Well, just being mindful that many of us came to this practice because we wish to alleviate suffering. And in the same way that we wish for our own suffering or discomfort to be alleviated, that's something we wish for everybody in this room, everyone we come in contact with, and everyone that we don't come in contact with. May all beings be safe from danger and harm. All beings be healthy in body and mind. May they live with peace and ease. May they be free of suffering. May it be so.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.